The Arizona flats don't care if you live or die. Out here in the territory, the land don't hurry. It just waits. Patient as stone. Patient as heat. Patient as the silence that presses down till breathin' feels like a debt you gotta earn with every miserable step. One gray dawn the soldiers came before first light. Rifles cracked sharp across the river camp like the crack of doom itself. Flames swallowed the lodges in hungry orange tongues. Smoke boiled black and thick. Screams rose sharp, then died away into something worse, the terrible quiet that follows when a whole world gets unmade in the dirt. From those ashes one woman walked. 11 days she crossed the killing ground. Dress torn, ragged blood dried stiff along her side, where she'd stitched her own wound with sinew and pure stubbornness. Every footfall paid in grief she refused to spend as tears. Tears cost water. Water meant survival. On the 12th day, the low line of buildings shimmered on the horizon duskwell, and beyond it, a small homestead. A man working his corral fence hammer in hand. Between the stranger from the desert and whatever came next, stood one simple gate. In this hard country, a gate ain't just wood and hinges, it's a choice, and some choices echo louder than any rifle shot ever could. The windmill turned slow in the heat. The flats watched, waitin'. The flats don't care if you live or die. That's the first thing you learn out there. The second thing is that the flats don't hurry. They just wait. Patient as stone, patient as heat, patient as the kind of silence that presses down on your chest until breathing feels like something you have to earn. Sarah had been walking for 11 days. 11 days since the soldiers came before dawn. 11 days since the smoke rose above the camp and the screaming stopped being screaming and became something worse, something quieter. 11 days of moving east across ground that offered nothing. No shade, no water that wasn't 3 hours out of the way, no path that didn't feel like a trap. She hadn't cried, not once. Not because she didn't feel it. She felt all of it. Every step was grief. Every horizon was loss. But crying cost water, and water was survival, and survival was the only argument she had left against the desert. Her dress was ruined, torn along the left shoulder where she'd caught it on a rock face climbing down a ridge in the dark. Torn again at the hip where the wound had wept through the cloth and dried brown and stiff in the heat. She'd sewn the wound herself on the 4th day, sat behind a boulder with her back straight and her kit spread on her knee, sinew thread, bone needle, a scrap of leather to bite, and she'd stitched herself closed with hands that shook exactly once and then stopped. She hadn't let them shake again. Every morning she stood up and pulled her shoulders back and told her body, not yet. Not today. We are not done yet. The town of Duskwell appeared on the horizon somewhere around midday. She stopped walking, stood there in the open heat and looked at it for a long moment. The low line of buildings, the false fronts, the water tower that stood up against the pale sky like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence she hadn't written. She knew towns like this. She knew exactly what she was to people in towns like this. She was a problem, a reminder, a thing that made men grip their rifle stocks a little tighter and women pull their children a little closer. She also knew she had 11 days of walking in her legs and a half-healed wound in her side and exactly nothing else. Turn back meant dying alone in the flats. Walk forward meant risk. She chose risk, because risk was at least a choice. Dying in the open wasn't. Her feet started moving again. The main street of Duskwell in July was the kind of place that looked like it was waiting for something bad to happen, and had been waiting a while. Dust on everything. The hitching posts out front of the saloon held 2 horses that had given up caring. The general store had a sign that had once said something and now just said weather. A dog slept in the shade of the church steps and didn't bother to lift its head. People noticed her. Of course they did. A woman. Apache, dress torn and blood-stained, walking in from the open flats at midday like she'd grown up from the ground. She felt the eyes before she saw them, felt the weight of them sliding over her from windows and door frames, felt the quality of silence that falls when a town decides something about you before you've spoken a word. She kept walking. On the outskirts, past the last cluster of houses, the road bent west toward open land. She followed it, because she knew this road. She'd known it once years ago before the world had rearranged itself into something unrecognizable. She remembered a creek south of here, She remembered the sound of it in summer. She remembered sitting beside it with a boy who had brown eyes and ears that stuck out a little too far, and who had given her a piece of soft bread from his coat pocket without making it seem like charity. She hadn't thought about that in years. Or maybe she'd thought about it every week and just hadn't admitted that to herself. The homestead sat at the end of the road like it had apologized for being there and then decided to stay anyway. Small, practical. A corral patched with boards from at least 3 different trees. A windmill that turned when the wind bothered. A house that had started as one room and then grown one cautious wall at a time into something slightly larger. A man was working at the corral fence, hammer in his hand, nail between his teeth, shirt dark with sweat across the shoulders. 30 years old, maybe, though he carried himself like someone older. The particular heaviness of a man who'd been deciding things alone for too long. Sarah stopped at the edge of the road. He hadn't seen her yet. Or she corrected herself he had, and was deciding what to do about it. Cobb Harlan saw her at the edge of the property, and he turned around, just like that, turned his back, walked toward the house, put his hand on the door. And the thing inside him that had been waiting to make a good decision for 5 years said, "You are doing it again." He stopped, hand on the door. The nail fell out from between his teeth, and he didn't bother to watch where it landed. He stood there for how long? 15 seconds, 20. Long enough for the heat to press down on the back of his neck and the windmill to creak twice and the world to not help him at all. Long enough for the memory to surface the way bad memories always do, not dramatically, not with warning, but sideways. Quiet. The way Ruel's face had looked in the lantern light in Kansas. Ruel, 5 years younger and 20 years braver. The kind of person who walked into a situation that needed someone to walk into it because that was simply what you did. Because Ruel didn't know yet that the world would not protect people who did that without backup. Cobb hadn't given backup. He'd stood outside and told himself it wasn't his fight and listened to the sounds, and in the morning Ruel was gone. 5 years. 5 years of Arizona territory and a homestead and quiet and trying to live small enough that he didn't have to be the person who stood outside again. And here he was, standing outside again. The door didn't open. He let go of it, turned around, walked back across the yard in the heat. His hands were not steady, and he didn't try to make them steady. He crossed to the gate and he pushed it open, and he stepped to the side and he stood there. He didn't say welcome. He didn't say anything at all. He just stood there with the gate open between them. Sarah looked at the open gate, looked at the man standing beside it. His face was weathered in the way desert country did to people, lines around the eyes, a jaw that had gotten used to being set, brown eyes, ears that stuck out a little too far. She knew those ears. The recognition hit her somewhere in the chest. Not like warmth, more like a door opening in a room she'd walled off a long time ago. She hadn't known who lived here. She'd followed the road from memory, and the memory had been about a creek and a boy and bread from a coat pocket, not about finding anyone in particular. She hadn't let herself hope for anyone in particular. But there he was, older, harder, carrying something heavy in the set of his shoulders, the kind of weight that doesn't come from work. She crossed through the gate. Her knees threatened just once, and she straightened them through stubbornness alone. A bucket of water sat on the stoop in the shade. She reached for the ladle and drank without asking permission, because permission was a luxury she had used up 11 days ago. The water was warm and tasted of the tin bucket, and it was the best thing she had swallowed in a week. Cobb watched her from a few feet away. She set the ladle down and looked at him directly. "You don't recognize me," she said. Not a question, a test. He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not the polite blankness that settlers used when they were deciding whether to pretend. Something real. "Creek south of here," he said finally. "You used to sit there, summer. You had a pouch of berries. You had bread from your coat." "It was my mother's bread." He paused. "She wasn't happy I gave it away." "Did you tell her?" "No." The ghost of something moved across Sarah's face. Not quite a smile. Not quite not a smile. She looked away toward the open flats she'd come from. 11 days of that. And then this. A man she'd known as a child who had stood outside his own door for 20 seconds and then decided to come back. She didn't know yet what that meant. She knew it was enough for today. Inside the house was plain the way a man's house gets when he's stopped expecting company. One table, 2 chairs that didn't match. A bed pushed against the far wall made up with military precision, the kind of neatness that came not from pride, but from the need to control something when everything else felt uncontrollable. Shelves with jars. Dried beans, corn, something that might have been coffee once. Tools stacked in the corner with the careful organization of a person who couldn't afford to lose anything and knew it. 1 cup on the shelf. 1 coat on the hook by the door. Cobb set a plate on the table. Leftover cornbread, a heel of salt pork beans from the morning. Sarah sat. She ate slowly, pacing herself because her stomach had shrunk to the size of a fist, and she knew overeating now would cost her. Cobb poured water into a basin and set a clean cloth beside it. He pulled the other chair out and sat down across from her, arms resting on his knees, eyes somewhere on the middle distance between them. "You walked from where?" he said. "The Gila River." She kept her voice even. "West of here. Weeks. The soldiers came in May. My people scattered." She paused, took another small bite. "I kept moving east, avoided trails where I could. Dogs are the problem. You can hide from men. Dogs are harder." Cobb absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, the way his jaw tightened, then released. The way he didn't try to say anything useful. Most people said something useless when they heard things like this. Something about being sorry. Something about how terrible. Something that was more about making themselves comfortable than about acknowledging what they were being told. Cobb said nothing. She found that she preferred it. When she'd eaten half the plate, careful measured, she reached into the pouch tied under her dress and pulled out her kit. Sinew thread, bone needle, a scrap of cloth. "The wound needs proper closing," she said. "I need better light." He got up without a word, moved the lamp to the edge of the table, set it close, then stood near enough to help if her hands failed, which they did. Once. The first stitch slipped and her hand shook once sharply and she stopped. Breathed. Cobb leaned in slightly, not reaching for the needle, just holding the light steadier. "Take it slow," he said. "Not, I'll do it. Not, let me help. Just take it slow." She set her jaw and took it slow and stitched herself closed again. When she knotted the last stitch, her face was pale and her hands were not shaking anymore. Cobb moved to the stove without being asked and dropped a pinch of willow bark into a tin cup of hot water. Set it in front of her. She wrapped a strip of cloth firm around her ribs. She picked up the cup. She looked at him across the rim of it just briefly, just long enough, and gave a single small nod. He nodded back. The lamp burned between them. The house settled. Outside, the Arizona evening came on slow and orange, and somewhere in the corral, the horses shifted and the windmill made its sound. Neither of them said anything for a long time. It was the kind of silence that has weight but no pressure. The third morning brought the sheriff. Sarah had expected it. Towns talked. That was the whole point of townspeople living close enough together to see each other's business and close enough together to have opinions about it. She was in the yard when she heard the horse. She didn't go inside. Running inside would look like guilt, and she had nothing to be guilty about. She turned to face the road and stood there open, visible, waiting. Iron Price was not what she expected. She'd expected young, ambitious, the kind of sheriff who wore his badge like an argument. Instead, she got 55 years of something harder than ambition, a man who'd been in the war and carried it around in his eyes the way veterans did, not with pride, but with the weight of things seen that couldn't be unseen. His face was the kind that had stopped caring whether it looked friendly a long time ago. He pulled up at the fence and looked at her. Not hostile, not warm, assessing. Cobb came out from the corral. "Sheriff," he said. "Cobb." Price's eyes moved between them, settled on Sarah. "The Such boy was in the store this morning with his ears wide open. Whole town knows by now." "I expect so." "You know how they'll take it." "I know how some of them will take it." Price was quiet for a moment. His horse stamped and he let it without adjusting the reins. She was. Apache. Sarah answered before Cobb could. Yes, my name is Sarah. My people were pushed east of the Gila River by soldiers in May. I walked here. I have broken no law in this county or any other. Price looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She had learned a long time ago that lowering your eyes was an invitation for certain people, an invitation to believe you already agreed you were less than they were. She kept her eyes level and let the silence be whatever it needed to be. I didn't come to run you off, Price said finally. Then why did you come? To let Cobb know what he stepped into. The sheriff looked at the man by the corral. This doesn't stay quiet. You keep her here, people are going to have things to say about it. And some of those people are going to say them to my face, and some are going to say them in ways I can't stop. Cobb leaned against the fence post. His voice stayed flat. She hasn't broken any law. I didn't say she had. Then there's nothing to discuss. Price studied him. Something moved in the old man's eyes. Not agreement, not disagreement. The expression of a man running numbers that don't add up neatly. I'll tell folks they're under my eye, he said finally. That buys time, not protection, time. He tipped his hat not at Cobb, at Sarah. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward Duskwell at the same unhurried pace he'd arrived. Sarah watched him go. Cobb appeared beside her at the fence. He's not a bad man, Cobb said. I know, Sarah said. Bad men don't bother explaining themselves. That night she lay on the bed. Cobb had taken the chair without discussion, without making it a sacrifice, just moved to the chair and sat. And that was that. And she listened to the desert outside the single window. Cicadas. Wind. The occasional low sound of cattle. She had slept in worse places. On the ground in arroyos. Against rock faces. Curled behind boulders with one ear open for footsteps. Here the door had a latch. Here someone was on the other side of the room. She pressed her fingers against the tied cloth at her ribs and breathed carefully, and stared at the ceiling and tried to decide how she felt about this. Grateful. Obviously. That was the easy part. But also aware. Aware that gratitude was a debt, and debts in this world were collected in ways you didn't always choose. Aware that this man, this boy grown into a hard-shouldered man who remembered a creek and soft bread, was risking something real to let her through his gate. Aware that kindness in her experience came with an expiration date. She turned her face toward the wall, and then because she couldn't help it, she thought about his ears, still sticking out too far. Exactly the same, on a completely different face from the one she'd known by the creek, older, harder, closed in ways that boy hadn't been closed, but the ears identical. Something close to warmth moved through her chest. She did not name it. She closed her eyes. In the chair across the room, Cobb sat with his forearms on his knees and stared at the floor and thought about rule. He did this most nights. Tonight he added something to the ritual the moment he had stood with his hand on the door, the 20 seconds between the man who kept turning away and the man who came back. He thought about those 20 seconds for a long time. She was going to leave before dawn. She'd decided it somewhere between the first gray hour and the second, when the world is neither dark nor light, and decisions feel most honest. She had no right to cost him more than he'd already paid. The sheriff had come on day 3. Men like the ones she'd seen watching from the saloon would not stay watchers forever. She had her kit, her pouch, her worn-down boots. She opened the door quietly. He was already on the stoop. Not waiting, that was the thing. He wasn't sitting there watching the road for her the way someone would if they'd planned this moment. He was just there, sitting in the early dark with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance and a cup of something that had gone cold in his hands. He looked up when the door opened. She looked at him. He looked at her. At his feet, not presented, not arranged, not offered with any kind of ceremony, sat a pair of worn leather boots. Old. His. The only spare thing in a house that had no spare things. He didn't say stay. He didn't say please. He didn't say anything at all about the boots, or about her, or about what any of this meant. He just looked at her, and then looked back at the horizon, and the boots sat there between them in the dark like a sentence that didn't need finishing. Sarah looked at the boots for a long moment. Then she set her pack down on the stoop beside him, sat down herself, and together they watched the Arizona sky go from black to gray to the kind of pale gold that means the day has decided to start whether you're ready or not. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. Somewhere east of Duskwell, in the main house of a ranch that was larger than it had any honest right to be, Denton Vare sat at a table with a glass of whiskey and a map he didn't need to look at anymore because he had it memorized. The land north of Duskwell. Good land. Not the best land, but the right land. The kind that sat between two water sources and controlled the approach to the ridge and would matter enormously in 10 years when more people came west as they always came west as they would keep coming west until there was nothing left to come to. He had wanted it for 2 years. He had been patient for 2 years. The problem had always been Cobb Harlan. Not because Harlan was powerful. He was nothing a drifter who'd settled a man with one good season and a patched corral. The problem was that Harlan wouldn't sell and wouldn't be pressured and wouldn't be moved, and Vare had learned a long time ago that the worst thing a small man could be was immovable. Immovable small men were a problem, but not an unsolvable one. Vare turned his glass slowly. He knew Harlan. He'd known him since 1872 when the man had worked briefly on this ranch and then walked away from a steady wage because of a decision Vare had made about some Navajo farmers and a water right. Harlan had walked away without a word. No confrontation, no accusation, just gone. Which told you something about the man principled enough to leave cautious enough not to fight. Principled men were easier to move than you'd think. You just needed the right lever. And now there was an Apache woman sleeping in Harlan's house. Vare's man at the store had told him this morning. The whole town was already talking. And Vare, listening to the talk, had felt the sensation of a problem rearranging itself into an opportunity. Public pressure was one lever. Legal instruments were another. He had access to both. He poured 2 fingers more of whiskey and looked at the map and did not hurry. He had been patient for 2 years. He could be patient a little longer. On the 4th morning, Sarah swept the porch. Not because anyone asked, not to prove anything. Because it needed doing, and she was there, and her hands needed work, the way a wound needs to be kept clean, not from vanity, but from the basic logic of maintenance. Cobb watched from the corral hammer, paused mid-swing. She swept without rushing and without performing. Moved a chair to get the corners. Set it back at a slightly better angle than it had been. Stepped off the stoop and cleared the loose gravel at the base of the steps. When she finished, she looked at the result with the eye of someone who had done this 10,000 times and knew what good work looked like. Acceptable. She went inside to start the beans. Cobb lowered his hammer. He was not a man who made friends easily. Not because he was unpleasant, he tried not to be, but because friendship required you to let someone into the space around you, and Cobb had spent 5 years carefully making that space contain exactly nothing that could be taken away. Nothing that when it was gone would leave the particular kind of silence that Ruel's absence had left. He knew what he was doing when he opened the gate. He just hadn't known what it would feel like after. It felt like a person in his house making the beans smell different, sweeping the porch to a better angle. He went back to work. That afternoon, the storekeeper's boy came down the road. 11 years old, sack of feed over one shoulder, and his eyes wide open the way children's eyes are when they've been sent to look at something their parents were too proud to stare at openly. He stopped at the fence, stared at Sarah sitting on the stoop, stared long enough to memorize, then ran back toward town at the speed of news. Sarah watched him go without expression. Cobb came out of the corral and saw the dust the boy was kicking up. "Started," Cobb said. "It started before I sat down," Sarah said. "The moment I walked down that street." He came to stand beside her, looked down the road the boy had run. "What do you want to do?" he said. The question surprised her. Not because it was unusual to be asked questions, but because of how genuinely open it was. He wasn't asking as a formality. He was asking because he actually didn't know and actually wanted to know. She thought about it. "Stay visible," she said finally. "Work. People here measure worth in work. If I'm seen as a shadow, they'll fill in what they don't know. If I'm seen working," she paused, "they still might fill it in, but it's harder." Cobb nodded slowly. There's fence on the north side needs resetting. I could use a hand with the wire." "Show me," she said, and they went to work. The fence was worse than he'd said. 3 posts leaning, one section of wire down, entirely rolled at the foot of a split post like it had given up. Ground undercut by wind and cattle that didn't care about property lines. They worked through the afternoon in the heat. Cobb dug. Sarah held the posts upright, careful with her side, working around the pane the way you work around a post that's set wrong. You don't remove it, you adjust. When the wire slipped, she adjusted her grip without waiting for instruction. When a post leaned the wrong direction, she said so, and was right, and they reset it. Neither of them spoke much. What they did say was functional. "Hold there. Pull tighter. Hand me the other end." The language of shared work, short, necessary, implying a level of trust that was operational before it was personal. By midday, they'd reset 2 posts and braced a corner. They rested in the shade of the fence line with tin cups of water. Cobb said, "You've done this work before." "Not fence wire," Sarah said, "but work. My people didn't stand still." "No." He looked at his hands. "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant." She drank. "You meant I know what I'm doing." "Yes, I do." He almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that she noticed. They went back to work. At dusk, Cobb rode to the store for flour and salt. He also bought a bolt of coarse cotton. The storekeeper watched him put it on the counter with the expression of a man deciding whether something was worth the trouble. Cobb looked at him and waited. The storekeeper cleared his throat and wrote the purchase in his ledger. "Cotton's for her," Cobb said, though no one had asked. The storekeeper kept writing. Outside, 2 men leaned against the saloon rail and watched Cobb load his horse. He looked at them directly. They looked back. Nobody moved. When he got home, Sarah had swept the porch again. The dust had come back and washed the tin cups and gathered kindling in a neat stack by the door. He handed her the bolt of cotton without ceremony. She took it with both hands and a nod. They ate dinner beans she'd stretched with herbs from her pouch cornbread from what he had left, and the lamp burned between them, and the house held their separate silences. Afterward, Cobb stared at the floor for a moment. Then he said, "There's good soil in the back quarter. If it gets a windbreak, the right kind, you could run corn there. Beans, too." He didn't know entirely why he said it. Maybe to test what it sounded like, a future spoken aloud. In this house, in this space. Sarah looked at the floor and then at him. "Windbreak needs to be set low," she said. "Brush and scrub, not high timber. High timber makes gaps. Wind finds the gaps." She paused. "South of the Gila we set them that way. Worked even in bad years." The sentence landed in the room. Not a promise, not an agreement, just knowledge offered, just the future touching the present for a second, and then pulling back careful like testing ice to see if it holds. Cobb nodded. "That's what I'd need," he said. Outside, the first stars came out over the Arizona territory. The windmill turned slowly. The cattle settled. The bolt of cotton hung on the peg by the door next to his coat, and nobody moved it. The 6th day started wrong. Not dramatically. Not the kind of wrong that announces itself with thunder or shouting. The air had a particular weight to it. Heavy. Pressurized. Like the sky was holding something it hadn't decided what to do with yet. Sarah noticed it before breakfast. She stood on the porch with her cup and looked west and felt it on her face. That stillness. The way the grasses in the distance all leaned the same direction and then stopped like they'd been told to wait. The way the cattle in the corral pressed toward the east fence instead of spreading out the way they normally did at dawn. Animals knew. She'd learned that before she learned almost anything else. She went back inside. "Storm coming?" she said. Cobb looked up from the stove. "How long?" "Midday, maybe before." He set down the coffee pot, looked at her face, decided she was right without asking how she knew. Which was she noticed that. The not asking how she knew. Most people needed to understand the mechanism before they trusted the conclusion. Cobb just looked at her face and moved. That was something. They worked fast. Cobb hauled water to the troughs while Sarah tied cloth over the tops to keep the grit out. She moved with her side braced, not hiding the pain, now just working around it. The windmill needed bracing. Cobb climbed while Sarah steadied the base and called up measurements, and he didn't once tell her she didn't need to bother. They nailed 2 loose boards over the west gapser, holding the board flush against the frame. Him driving nails, the hammer jarring through the wood and into her palms, and she held every time. "Inside," Cobb said when the sky turned the color of old copper. "The east fence." "Inside now." She looked at the sky. He was right. She hated that he was right. They got inside with maybe 3 minutes to spare. The storm hit like a wall, not like weather, like a decision, like something had been building pressure for days and finally ran out of patience. The wind came first, a sound like a freight train deciding to be a voice, and then the dust. Brown. Total. The world outside the window disappeared in under a minute. Just gone. Like it had never been there. The house groaned, every board finding its voice at once. The stove popped. The window shutters fought their latches. Dust seeped under the door in a thin, steady line, patient, relentless, the way water finds every low point. Cobb stuffed cloth into the gaps around the door frame. Sarah dampened rags from the water bucket and laid them along the sill. They moved around each other in the small space without discussion, without collision, like 2 people who had been sharing this particular square footage for much longer than 6 days. Which they hadn't. Which was strange. When there was nothing left to do, they sat. Cobb at the table, Sarah on the edge of the bed with her elbows on her knees, the lamp burning between them, the flame steady, because no air was moving in here, everything sealed, everything held in. The world outside howled. In here, stillness, lamp flame, the smell of dust even through the sealed door. "How long?" Sarah said. "Could be hours." Cobb looked at the ceiling, listening to the roof flex. "Could be tomorrow." "I've seen 3 days." "So have I." He paused. "This one doesn't feel like 3 days." She looked at him. "How does it feel?" He thought about it. Actually thought about it the way he thought about most things, slowly, seriously, not rushing to an answer just to fill the space. "Like something that needed to happen," he said finally. She wasn't sure if he meant the storm. She didn't ask. They ate what was in the pot. Beans with grit by the second spoonful despite everything. Cornbread that tasted of dust at the edges. They ate anyway because bodies didn't care about aesthetics. Cobb watched her across the table. Not staring. Just noticing. The way she took small, measured amounts and didn't rush. The way she sat with her back straight, even now exhausted, in a sealed house with a storm trying to take the roof. He'd been trying to figure out since the moment he opened the gate what word went with this woman. Not fragile. Obviously not fragile. Not hard either. Hard people didn't remember a boy with bread from a coat pocket. Resilient wasn't right. Resilient implied you'd been bent. She didn't look bent. She looked like someone who had decided at some point very early in her life that breaking was simply not one of the available options, and had arranged everything around that decision. He found it humbling, because he had broken. Quietly. In Kansas, in a doorway, in the 20 seconds he'd stood with his hand on a latch and not turned it. He'd broken right there and spent 5 years in Arizona territory pretending the crack wasn't there. He looked at his hands. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." "I don't sleep much." "Neither do I." She looked at the window, nothing but brown dark pressing against it. "Before, when I had people around me, I slept well. Now I sleep with one ear open." Waiting for what? For whatever comes next. A beat. There is always something next. Cobb nodded slowly. He knew that vigilance. Not the same as hers, not even close to the same as hers. But the shape of it. The way sleep became a negotiation instead of a surrender. Ruel used to sleep like the dead, he said. It came out unexpected. He hadn't planned to say it. Ruel existed in his chest, and nowhere else. That was the whole structure of his life in Duskwell. But it came out. Sarah didn't react dramatically, didn't lean forward, didn't say, "Who is Ruel?" She just turned her face slightly toward him and waited the way she waited for things, patient, unhurried, like she had all the time the storm had. "My brother," Cobb said. "Younger, 5 years." Silence. "Kansas," he said, then stopped, then started again. because apparently tonight was the night for this. He didn't know why. Maybe the storm, maybe the sealed house, maybe the lamp flame standing perfectly still in the unmoving air. Maybe because this woman had walked 11 days across a desert with a sewn-up wound and he owed her at least honesty. "There was a fight," he said, "in a town in Kansas. I was working at a stockyard. Ruel was passing through. He did that, he moved around, he didn't stay still the way I did. He came through and we had 2 days together, and then on the second night there was trouble at a saloon down the street. Some men, drunk, hurting someone who didn't deserve it." He stopped. Sarah said nothing. "Ruel went in," Cobb said. "He just went. That was how he was. He didn't ask me. He didn't have to ask me, it should have been obvious. You go in, you help, that's what you do." He looked at the lamp. "I stood outside. I told myself it wasn't my fight. I told myself Ruel was faster than me. I told myself a lot of things that sounded like reasons and weren't." The storm pressed against the walls. "In the morning," Cobb said. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your brother didn't die because you were silent." She said it carefully, not quickly, like she was laying each word down with intention. "He died because no one ever taught you that speaking up was something you were allowed to do, that going in was something you were allowed to do." She paused. "Men in your world learn to measure risk before they move. That's what they're taught. Sometimes the measurement takes too long." Cobb looked at her. "That's not forgiveness," she said. "I know. It's not absolution. I know. It's just—" She looked at the window. "The truth of how it happened, which is different from what you've been telling yourself." He was quiet for a long time. "What have I been telling myself?" he said. Not a challenge. A genuine question. "That you're a coward," Sarah said, "and that a coward is what you are permanently fixed, nothing to be done about it." She turned to look at him directly. "But you opened the gate." He didn't say anything. "A coward," she said, "would have stayed inside." The lamp burned. Cobb looked at his hands for a long moment. Then he got up and added wood to the stove, because the night was going to be long and the fire needed tending, because some responses don't come in words, because some things you can only answer by the way you keep moving. Sarah lay down. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since the soldiers came in May, she slept without keeping one ear open. The storm broke before dawn, dropped the way it had come all at once like a decision reversed. One moment the world was howling. The next silence. Complete. Almost startling in its depth. Cobb opened the door. The yard looked like it had been buried and partially excavated. Drift lines against the fence posts. The corral gate half blocked. The windmill standing blades motionless in the sudden dead air. Sarah appeared beside him. They stood in the doorway and looked at it. "Could have been worse," Cobb said. "The cattle, all standing." She exhaled, long, steady. "The troughs, we covered them." He looked at her. "You covered them." She almost said it was nothing, stopped herself, because it wasn't nothing. She'd learned to call things nothing because calling them something invited people to dispute their value. But Cobb wasn't disputing. "Yes," she said, "I did." They went to work. Day 9 came with clear skies and the brittle brightness that follows dust storms. Everything scoured, everything sharp-edged. Sarah was at the well behind the Duskwell Church before she had any specific plan to be there. She and Cobb had come to town for supplies. He was at the store. She had walked this way because she didn't want to stand and be stared at while he bought flour. The church well had a cover over it. Or what had been a cover, the storm had worked at the wood and the wood had let it. She could see from 20 feet away that the boards had shifted, that the center wasn't sitting flush. She was looking at it when she heard the sound, a soft crack, then a high, sharp cry that lasted 2 seconds and then stopped. She was running before the echo died. The boy was maybe 7. He'd stepped onto the cover and the cover had gone. Simple as that. The way disasters always are simple. A board that had one storm too many in it. A child who didn't know yet that the world contained boards that looked solid and weren't. He was on a ledge inside the well, 8, 10 feet down. She could hear him small, ragged breathing past screaming into the white, silent territory of pure shock. The rope coiled at the base of the well was too short. She knew because she measured it with her eyes before she touched it. Habit. Measure first, then move. People were coming. She could hear running feet on the main street. She could hear a woman's voice, the mother that pitch that cuts through everything. Sarah looked at the well, looked at the rope, looked at the distance. Then she took the rope and tied it around her own waist. Not ceremonial, not dramatic, just this was the problem. This was the solution. This was what came next. "I need someone to hold the other end," she said, loud, clear. For 3 seconds nobody moved, because she was Apache, because she was a woman, because she was the stranger from Harlan's place, and this was Duskwell, and Duskwell had opinions. Then Cobb was there. She didn't know how he'd gotten there so fast. He just appeared at the well's edge and took the rope in both hands and braced his feet and looked at her with an expression that said, "I've got you. Go." She went. The inside of the well was narrow, cold after the desert heat, the stone walls close enough to touch on both sides. She lowered herself hand over hand, Cobb's weight above her, the only reason she wasn't falling, and the dark rose around her. The boy was on the ledge, eyes wide, breathing in small, quick pulls. "Hey," Sarah said, soft. "Hey, look at me." He looked at her. "I'm going to take you up," she said. "I need you to hold on to my shoulders. Can you do that?" He stared. "I need you to nod," she said. "Just nod if you can do that." He nodded. "Good." She positioned herself at the ledge. "Arms around my neck. Hold tight. Don't let go no matter what." He got his arms around her neck. She felt his weight, slight bird-light shaking, and she pressed her lips together and thought ribs. You can deal with the ribs later. Right now is not later. "Pull," she called up. Cobb's hands were going to have rope burn for a week. He didn't notice. He was pulling, hand over hand, steady. No jerking would swing them, and swing was bad. Every muscle in his back and arms and legs committed to this single act. Other men stepped up beside him, grabbed the rope above his hands. He felt the weight redistribute, still heavy but shared, and they pulled together. First the boy's head cleared the stone rim. The mother made a sound that was not a word. The pastor grabbed the child under the arms and pulled him clear. And then Cobb was pulling Sarah lighter now, just her hand over hand, and her hands appeared on the rim, and he grabbed her wrists and pulled, and she came over the edge and sat hard in the dirt, coughing, eyes closed, both hands pressed to her ribs. The boy was in his mother's arms, breathing, crying the good kind now, the kind that means you're safe enough to feel the fear you couldn't feel while you were in it. The crowd was very quiet. Then Willa Such, the grandmother, the woman who had watched from the store window for days and said nothing, stepped forward. She crouched down, and she put her hand on Sarah's shoulder, gently, without asking, without announcing it, just her hand, on Sarah's shoulder, warm and solid and real. Sarah went very still. She didn't look up immediately. She was too busy not crying, which took more effort than the well had. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and breathed through her nose and looked at the ground until the moment passed. Then she looked up at Willa Such. Willa was crying. She didn't seem to mind that she was crying. "You saved him," Willa said. Sarah looked at the boy in his mother's arms, looked at the crowd, shifting, uncertain, rearranging people who had come to watch a crisis and were now having to figure out what they thought about who had resolved it. "He needed saving," Sarah said. Sheriff Price arrived 6 minutes late, which he would think about afterward with the dissatisfaction of a man who prides himself on being where things happen. He took in the scene, the rope, the wet-eyed mother, the boy. Sarah sitting in the dirt with her hand pressed to her side. Cobb standing over her with rope burn on both palms. He looked at Cobb. Cobb looked at him. Price adjusted his hat. He did that when he was rearranging something in his head, when the numbers he'd been running were coming out different than they had before. He tipped his hat at Sarah. Just that, and rode back toward his office. Day 12. They came from the east. 2 men on good horses, the kind that covered distance and didn't stop to admire the scenery. Dusters that had seen significant travel, eyes that moved to everything and settled on nothing for long. Sarah saw them from the north fence line where she and Cobb were working wire. "Don't look," Cobb said quietly. He'd seen them too. "I'm not looking," she said. She was absolutely looking. "Who are they?" "I don't know yet." He set down the wire stretcher. "Go to the house." "I'm not—" "Sarah." His voice was quiet, serious, not commanding, just please do this one thing. "Go inside. Not because you're hiding, because I need to know where you are." She looked at him. Then she walked to the house, went inside, stood at the window where she could see everything. Cobb went to the gate. They stopped at the fence. The taller one, broad across the shoulders, a face like it had been negotiated out of harder material, did the talking, slow, deliberate. "We're looking for an Apache woman," he said. "Connected to a raiding party near the Gila River, May of this year." He reached into his coat and produced folded papers. "Got paperwork from the Pima County Sheriff's Office." Cobb looked at the papers without touching them. "She responsible for specific charges," he said. "Associated party. Location puts her in the region." "Location. That's it." "That's enough for a question." "Is it?" Cobb kept his voice flat. "You ride a long way for a question." "We get paid for a long way." The second man hadn't spoken. He was watching the house. "She here?" Cobb looked at both of them. He thought about Kansas, the stockyard and the saloon and the doorway and the 20 seconds that had defined 5 years. He thought about Ruel's face in the lantern light, young and brave and already gone. He thought about Sarah's hands on the fence wire, the way she'd gone into that well without hesitation, the way she'd sat in the dirt afterward with Willa Such's hand on her shoulder. "You got paperwork," Cobb said. "Paperwork needs to be verified. We verified it in Pima County." "You're not in Pima County." Cobb crossed his arms. "You're in mine. Sheriff Price runs this territory. You want to make a claim, you make it to him. He checks the books. That's how it works here." The taller man's jaw tightened. "We're not obligated." "Yes, you are." Cobb didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You're obligated to the law of the county you're standing in, which is this one, which means Sheriff Price." Silence. The two men exchanged the look of men who had expected easier. "We'll find the sheriff ourselves," the taller one said finally. "I'm sure you will," Cobb said. They turned their horses and rode toward Duskwell. Sarah was at the table when he came in. She'd figured out most of it from the window and assembled the rest from the way Cobb walked, not relieved, not frightened. The gait of a man who had bought time and knew it. "Papers," she said. "From Pima County." He sat down. "Charging you with association to a raiding party. May of this year." "I was at the Gila River in May." Her voice was steady. "My people were there. The soldiers came and scattered everyone. I don't know what raid they mean." "I know." "The date on the papers—" "I didn't touch them." He looked at her. "But I saw the date, May 14th. I was moving east by May 14th, 2 days after the soldiers came." "I know." Simply, like it needed no evidence beyond her word. "Price will check the books. If the papers are real, they'll have a case number, a signing judge. Those can be verified. And if they're not real—" Cobb was quiet. "Where?" she said. He looked at the table. "I don't know that." "I do." Without anger, just fact. "I don't know his name, but I know his type. Men who want something and find a lever." She paused. "What does he want?" "The Northland. He's wanted it 2 years. Controls 2 water sources, good approach to the ridge." "And you won't sell?" "No." "So I'm the lever." He didn't answer. Because there was no point in answering a thing that was obviously true. Sarah looked at her hands on the table. "I should leave," she said. "No?" Immediate. Not angry. Certain. "Cobb." "No." He looked at her directly. "I spent 5 years being the man who lets things happen because it's easier than stopping them. I'm done with that man." He held her eyes. "You stay." She looked back at him. The certainty in his face was not performed. It was the certainty of someone who had thought about the cost completely and decided it was acceptable, which was different, which was the only kind that meant anything. "All right," she said, 2 words. But in this house, in this moment, they carried the weight of a decision that both of them knew would not be easily undone. Price looked at the papers for a long time. The bounty men sat across his desk and let him look. They were practiced at this patience. Price recognized the signing judge's name. That part was real. The case number format looked right, the date looked right, but something was off. He set the papers down, got up, went to the cabinet where he kept his own files, 7 years of them methodically organized because Price had learned that memory was unreliable and paper was not. He flipped through folders, stopped, pulled out a single document, unfolded it, looked at it next to the bounty papers. The case number on the bounty papers referenced a series from Pima County that, according to the document in Price's hand, a memorandum he had signed as witness in 1872, regarding the reorganization of county case filing systems, had not been in use after March of that year. More than 2 years before May of 1874. The format was right. The judge's name was real. The case number was impossible. Someone had built a very good forgery out of real parts. Price folded both documents, looked at the bounty men. "I'm going to need to verify these with the Pima County Clerk's office," he said. "That'll take time." "How much time?" the taller man said. "As much as it takes." Price met his eyes. "You're welcome to wait." They waited 2 days. Then they left. Not because Price told them to, because waiting cost money and their money had come from somewhere, and whoever had sent them had apparently decided that this particular approach wasn't working. Price watched them ride east. He put the documents in his cabinet. He sat at his desk for a long time. He thought about 1872, about a memorandum, about a man named Vare who had been at the county meeting where that memorandum was filed and would have known the case number series was obsolete. He thought about what he knew. He thought about what knowing obligated him to do. He thought about a debt he'd been carrying. Not money, not the kind you paid back with cash, but the kind you paid back with the accumulation of small compromises, small silences, small turnings away from things he'd seen and chosen not to see. He was 55 years old. He was tired, but he wasn't done. Not quite yet. Day 14. The fire low. Cobb was banking the stove for the night when he said it. Not looking at her. Eyes on the fire. The voice of a man who has decided to say a thing and is saying it before he can decide not to. "In Kansas," he said. "That night. After." He paused. "I told the sheriff it was a fight that got out of hand. I told Ruel's mother it happened too fast for anyone to stop it. I told everyone a version of the truth that had me outside before it started." He added a piece of wood. "I've told it so many times I almost believed it." Sarah was at the table, not moving. "Almost," she said. "Almost." He closed the stove door. "But you can't quite get there, with the ones that matter. You can convince yourself about a lot of things. Not that." She was quiet for a moment. "You've never told anyone," she said. "No." "Why now?" He turned to look at her, and the answer was in his face before he said it. Honest, unguarded, the face of a man who has stopped pretending to himself for long enough that he's forgotten to pretend to other people. "Because you went into a well," he said. "Without thinking, without calculating. You just went." He looked back at the fire. "I don't know how to do that yet, but I'm starting to understand what it costs not to." Sarah looked at him for a long time. "You know what you did," she said finally. "That's more than most men will ever admit, even to themselves." She paused. "Especially to themselves." He said nothing. "I'm not telling you it didn't happen," she said. "I'm not telling you Ruel's death wasn't connected to that night. I'm telling you—" She stopped, chose the words carefully. "A man who was what you think you are would not have opened the gate, would not have held that rope, would not be standing there telling me the truth he's hidden from everyone else for 5 years." She let that sit. "That man doesn't exist in this house. Whatever happened in Kansas." The stove ticked. The fire settled. Cobb stood with his back to her for a long moment. Then he sat down. He looked at her across the table, and his face had something in it that hadn't been there when she arrived. Not happiness, not relief. Something older and quieter. Something that looked like a man setting down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of his body. "The North Land needs a claim filed," he said. "Both names on the paper." She blinked. "The Homestead Act allows it," he said. "Married or working partnership. Both names, both parties have standing. Nobody can pull the land out from under one without going through both." She stared at him. "It's protection," he said. "Legal protection, which is the only kind that holds in a county with a judge." "Cobb, I'm not asking you to stay forever," he said. Steady, honest. "I'm asking you to have somewhere to stand, right now, in this county, with your name on paper that says this land is partly yours and you have a legal right to be on it." She was quiet. "Is this because you feel guilty?" she said. He thought about it, really thought about it. "Maybe at first," he said. "Not anymore." She looked at her hands, then at him. "All right," she said. The same two words. And they meant more than the first time, which had already meant more than she'd expected. Day 17. They rode to the county seat together. Price met them at the clerk's office. He didn't explain why he was there. He didn't need to. He was there because a man trying to use the last useful years of his life well had to start somewhere, and this was a start. The clerk looked at Cobb, looked at Sarah, looked at the papers. "Both names," the clerk said. "Both names," Cobb confirmed. The clerk wrote. Stamps were applied, papers were signed. Cobb's signature first, then Sarah's, each letter placed with the deliberate care of someone who understood that this page would outlast the moment. Price signed as witness. His hand was steady. Outside on the street, Sarah held the folded deed in both hands before tucking it into her pouch. She pressed her hand against it once, not to check if it was there, to remind herself it was real. Cobb stood beside her and watched her do this. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. The ride home was quiet. The good kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. That evening the bolt of cotton came down from the peg. Sarah spread it on the table and cut it careful, measured cuts, nothing wasted, and began to sew by lamplight, while Cobb sat across from her and worked at a piece of harness that needed mending. They didn't talk for a long time. Then Cobb said, "My mother used to sew at night." "Mine too," Sarah said. "She said it was the only time the house was quiet enough to think." She was right. He looked at the harness, looked at the lamp, looked at the woman across the table with her needle moving in and out of the cotton. "Sarah," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said, "for—" He stopped, because what came next was too large for a single sentence. For staying, for the well, for the storm, for the things she'd said in the lamplight about Ruel and silence and what it means to open a gate. She seemed to understand that the sentence was too large, because she just nodded once and went back to sewing. The lamp burned. The house held both of them. Outside, the Arizona night spread enormous and indifferent and beautiful in every direction, and the windmill turned in its slow, steady circle, and somewhere north of the property line the soil in the back quarter sat waiting for someone to plant something in it. Which someone would. Soon. August came in hot and certain, the kind of heat that doesn't apologize, that sits on the land like it owns it. The sun made decisions and everything else arranged itself accordingly, the cattle pressing to the shaded side of the corral, the dust lying flat and still in the windless noon, the distant ridges going white at the edges where the light hit hardest. Sarah was up before the sun. She always was now. Not from anxiety, or not entirely, but because she had discovered in the weeks since she'd arrived at Cobb Harlan's gate that she liked the hour before dawn. The way the desert held its breath before the heat arrived, the way you could stand on the porch and hear everything, coyote far off, the windmill turning slow, the sound of the land thinking. She stood there now with her cup and watched the sky go from black to old pewter to something approaching light. The deed was in her pouch. She pressed her hand against it sometimes without taking it out. The way you confirm something real not because you think it's gone but because the confirmation still surprises you. still lands with a small, quiet shock. My name is on paper in a county office, and that paper says I have a right to stand on this ground. Nobody gave her that. She had worked for it, held fence posts and rope and needle and a boy in the dark. She had stood before a sheriff without lowering her eyes. She had stayed when leaving would have been easier, and Cobb had signed his name beside hers. She heard him moving inside. She had learned his sounds the way you learn the sounds of a place you've decided to live in. The creak of the third floorboard, the stove door that needed a firm pull, the sound of him pouring coffee with his left hand because the right was usually already holding something else. She had stopped cataloging exits. She hadn't noticed exactly when that happened, but it had. Day 19 started with the sound of horses. Not two this time, more. Cobb heard it from the yard and Sarah heard it from the porch, and they looked at each other with an expression that needed no words, because they had both been expecting this. Not this specifically, but something. The other shoe. The next move in a game that Denton Vare had not stopped playing just because his bounty men rode away empty-handed. 6 horses. Coming down the main road toward the center of Duskwell. Not coming to the homestead. Not yet. Town meeting, Cobb said. How do you know? Because that's how Vare does it. He was already untying his horse. He doesn't come for you directly. He builds the crowd first. Gets enough people agreeing with him in a room that by the time he moves, it looks like the town decided not him. Sarah looked at the settling dust on the road. He's good at this, she said. He's had practice. Cobb looked at her. You should stay. Don't. Sarah, don't tell me to stay here. Quiet. Not angry. Just clear. I am not going to sit in this house and wait to find out what a room full of people decided about my life. He looked at her for a long moment. He wanted to argue. He was smart enough not to. Stay close, he said. Always, she said, and meant something slightly larger by it than the immediate practical instruction. The saloon in Duskwell was not a large room. It was large enough. Vare had timed it well mid-morning when the ranchers and store owners and men who worked the land had finished their first tasks and hadn't yet started their second, when they had time to stand and listen. He stood at the front and he didn't shout. That was the thing about Vare. He never shouted. Shouting was for men who needed to override the room. Vare needed to lead it, quietly, in a direction it was already inclined to go. He was maybe 60. Built like a man who had worked hard for 20 years and then managed hard for 20 more. Silver at the temples. Eyes that were not unkind, that was the dangerous thing about them. They looked like the eyes of a reasonable man, because he was a reasonable man, about most things. Reasonable and patient and utterly certain that the world should arrange itself to accommodate his vision of order. And his vision did not include an Apache woman with her name on a homestead deed in his county. I want to be plain with everyone here, he said. His voice was measured, unhurried, the voice of a man at church, not at war. I'm not here to speak against any individual. I'm here because I think we all have a stake in what happens to this town, what we're building out here. Murmurs, nods. We came west for something, he said. We built something. We bled for it, some of us literally. And now we've got a situation that I think, if we're honest with each other, makes people uncomfortable. Not because of hate. He paused. Let that sit. Because of uncertainty. Because we don't know what it means, what it leads to, what comes next. More murmurs. He was good. Sarah stood at the back of the room and watched him work and thought, yes, he is very good. He is saying nothing specific enough to argue with and everything general enough to mean anything. He is not saying, I want her gone. He is saying we need to think about what we're building, which is the same thing, but dressed in the clothes of community concern. She had heard versions of this speech before. Different words, same architecture. Cobb stood beside her, still, jaw set, watching Vare the way you watch something you are measuring. What I'm asking, Vare said, is that we have a conversation, as a community, about what kind of precedent we're setting. A pause. That's all I'm asking, a conversation. The room was quiet for a moment, and then Cobb said, Have it then. Every head turned. Vare looked at him with the expression of a man who had been expecting this and had already decided how to handle it. Patient, almost warm. "Cobb," he said. "Acknowledgement, not welcome." "You said conversation." Cobb moved through the crowd toward the front. Not aggressive, just moving through the way water moves. "So, let's have one. What specifically are you saying is wrong?" "I'm not saying anything is wrong." "Then what are you saying?" Vare smiled, slightly. "I'm saying there are questions worth asking." "Ask them." "Has anyone verified her background, her history, where she came from, what she was involved in before she arrived here?" "Yes," said Price. Everyone turned. Price was in the doorway, had been there for at least 5 minutes, Sarah realized. Standing just inside the frame with his hat in his hands and his face doing nothing in particular and his eyes doing everything. "The papers those men brought," Price said. "I looked at them. The case number series they used was retired by Pima County in March of 1872. Whoever filed those papers knew enough to make them look real. But the number was impossible." He looked at Vare. "Someone built a forgery out of real parts. Someone who knew the old filing system well." The room had gone very still. "I'm not making accusations," Price said, into the stillness. "I'm stating what the record shows." He put his hat back on. "The papers were false. The woman committed no crime in this or any other county on record. She has a legal claim to property in this territory, under the law, which is what I'm paid to uphold." Vare's face did not change dramatically. That was discipline. But something shifted behind his eyes. The recalculation of a man who has lost a piece and is deciding whether the game is still winnable. "I appreciate the sheriff's diligence," he said. "Even, smooth. That still doesn't address the broader question of Denton." It was Willa Such, standing up from her chair in the third row, a woman who did not typically stand up in rooms like this, a woman who had spent 40 years being useful and uncontroversial and reliable. "Denton," she said again. "She went into that well." Simple, just that. "She tied a rope around herself and went into a 10-foot well to bring my grandson out." Her voice was steady, slight shake at the edges but steady at the center. "He would have fallen off that ledge. He would have drowned in the dark." She looked around the room. "None of you went in." Silence. "I'm not saying that as a criticism," she said. "The well was narrow. The rope was short. She saw it and she acted and she brought him up." She paused. "I put my hand on her shoulder that day and I'd put it there again. And I'll stand next to her anywhere she needs standing next to." She sat back down, like it was nothing, like she hadn't just rearranged the room. The crowd shifted. You could feel it, like when wind changes direction. Not a dramatic reversal, not an instant transformation, but a slow, pressurized reorientation. People looking at each other differently, looking at Vare differently, looking at their own hands and thinking about a well and a rope and a boy who was home eating breakfast right now. 2 more people stood up, then a third, not with speeches, just standing. The way you say a thing without saying it. Vare looked at the room. He was good at reading rooms. What he was reading now was a room that had been his and was no longer his. Not because he'd been defeated in argument, because a woman had put her hand on another woman's shoulder, because Price had said the words "the papers were false" in a voice that contained 55 years of learning which hills to die on. Vare picked up his hat. He didn't storm out. Of course he didn't. He walked out the way he'd walked in measured, patient the face of a man who was simply continuing to think about something. He tipped his hat at the doorway at no one in particular, at the room in general, and he walked out into the August morning, and the door closed behind him. And the room breathed. Cobb found Sarah outside. She had stepped out before the end, not from defeat, from the particular reason of a person who has been the subject of a room's discussion and needs air, needs to stand outside and be a body in the world instead of an argument in someone else's mouth. She was at the edge of the main street, eyes on the horizon. "He's gone," Cobb said. "For now. Maybe for good." She didn't say anything to that, because she had learned in 23 years not to count on for good. You counted on for now. You built for now. You were grateful for now. Price, she said. Yeah. He knew about those papers before today. She looked at Cobb. The way he said it, he'd already verified it. He just waited for the right moment. Cobb looked toward the sheriff's office. Because saying it in that room in front of Ver, in front of everyone, that's different from saying it privately. In private, Ver can negotiate. In that room, there's nothing to negotiate. He paused. Price picked the moment. Let Ver make his case first, then landed it where everyone could hear. Sarah absorbed this. He's smarter than he looks, she said. He always has been. A pause. He just picks his moments carefully. She looked at the sheriff's office. She thought about a man who had stood in a doorway and said the papers were false in a voice that cost him something, because it always cost something standing up in a room and saying the true thing. It cost you the pretense that you could be neutral, that you weren't involved. Price had given that up today, deliberately. Day 22 came in dark, actually dark. Cloud cover from the west, the kind that built slowly through the day and by evening had turned the sunset the color of a bruise. No wind yet, but the air had weight to it. Thinking, deciding. Sarah noticed it at supper time. She didn't say anything, but she moved the water bucket inside. She checked the latch on the door twice, and after supper, when Cobb went to bank the stove, she sat at the table with her cup and faced the door. Cobb noticed. He didn't ask. He just moved the rifle from its hooks to the table and sat down across from her and faced the door as well. They sat there for an hour, maybe more. His coffee went cold. Neither of them moved to heat it. And then hoofbeats. Not one horse, not two, three, maybe four. Moving fast from town and turning toward the homestead. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. Here it is. Here is the thing that comes after the almost win. The thing that was waiting while Ver walked out of that room looking patient and reasonable. The thing that doesn't need Ver anymore because it was always bigger than one man. Stay behind me, Cobb said. Absolutely not, she said. He looked at her. I'm standing next to you, she said. Not behind you, next to you, that's what next to means. He held her gaze for one long second, then he stood up, took the rifle, and went to the door. 3 men at the fence. Not Ver's people or not directly, the free-floating kind. The men who didn't work for anyone in particular but could be relied upon to be where the excuse was available. One had a torch, already lit. The flame moved slow and orange in the heavy air. Cobb stepped off the porch. He didn't have the rifle up. He carried it at his side, present visible, not aimed. There was a significant difference between those things, and he wanted these men to understand all of them simultaneously. Evening, he said. Harlan, the one in the middle. Scarred cheek, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this. We've been talking about the situation. What situation? The one in your house. Cobb was quiet. We're not here for trouble, Scarred cheek said, and meant it in the way men mean things when they've already decided what they're going to do and want to believe the thing they're doing isn't trouble. We're here to let you know the town's patience runs out. Does it? Cobb said. You keep her here, you're choosing her over this town, over the people who built this place. I know what I'm choosing, Cobb said. Then you know what comes with it. The torch was very orange in the dark. Sarah was beside him. She had come out the moment he stepped off the porch because that was what next to meant. She stood close enough to Cobb that her shoulder was almost touching his arm, hands visible, eyes on the man with the torch. She thought, I am not afraid of you, which was not entirely true, but true enough to stand on. I came here with nothing, she said. Her voice was quiet. Not performing quiet, actually quiet. The way you speak when you want to be heard and no shouting is the wrong frequency. I walked 11 days across open desert with a wound in my side. One man opened his gate. She looked at the 3 men. The torch. I have worked this land. I have held this fence. I went into a well that none of you went into, and I brought a child up from it. She paused. I am not asking you to love me. I am not asking you to want me here. I am asking you to see me." The man with the torch said nothing. "I have broken no law in this county," she said. "I have harmed no one in this town, and I have a legal right to stand on this ground. If you burn this fence, you are breaking the law, and I will be standing here when the sheriff arrives." Silence. The torch burned, and then from the road behind the 3 horses came the sound of a single horse, moving slow. The purposeful slowness of a man who had already decided where he was going and didn't need to hurry. Price. He rode up alongside the 3 men and stopped his horse and looked at them with the expression of a man looking at something that has been happening in this territory for 30 years and has gotten tired of happening. He didn't draw his revolver. He didn't need to. "That fence is private property," he said. "The torch is a threat to private property. I'd like you to put it out." The man with the torch looked at Price, looked at Cobb, looked at Sarah, looked at the torch in his own hand like he was seeing it for the first time. He put it out against his saddle horn. The flame died with a small hiss. "This isn't over," Scarred Cheek said, but it came out smaller than he'd intended. "Go home," Price said. They went. The 3 of them stood at the fence until the sound of hooves faded. Price on his horse, Cobb and Sarah on foot. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Price looked at Sarah. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. He nodded. He looked at Cobb. Something in his face, the expression of a man who has finally done the thing he should have done earlier and has come to a grudging peace with the cost of the delay. "I should have said something sooner," Price said. "About Vare, about the papers. I knew for a while." Cobb looked at him. "Why didn't you?" "Because I'm old, and I'm tired, and I've spent a long time picking which hills were worth dying on." He exhaled, slow. "Started to wonder if I'd run out of hills worth dying on before I ran out of time to die on them." Sarah looked at this man with 55 years of something difficult in his eyes and a badge that had been heavier some years than others. "You came tonight," she said. "I did. That's worth something." He looked at her, and something in the old watchful face softened by exactly 1 degree. Not warmth, recognition. The look of a man who has been seen accurately by a person who had every reason to see him less generously. "I expect it is," he said. He tipped his hat, rode back toward Duskwell. Inside, Cobb put the rifle back on its hooks. Sarah sat at the table. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Cobb laughed. Not a big laugh, a small one. Surprised out of him. The laugh of a man who has been braced for something catastrophic and found instead something survivable. Sarah looked at him. "What?" she said. "He put the torch out on his own saddle horn," Cobb said. "The man with the torch. He put it out on his own saddle horn." She thought about it. She laughed too. Small, brief, but real. The kind of laugh that comes from the chest and means the chest is still capable of lightness even after what had just happened, which was something, which was, in fact, a great deal. They sat there in the lamplight and let the tension find its way out of the room. And then Cobb said, "Marry me," just like that. No preamble, no kneeling, no arrangement of flowers or careful selection of moment, just the words. Said the way he said most things he meant quietly, directly, without performance. Sarah stared at him. He looked back with the face of a man who had surprised himself and was deciding whether to walk it back. He decided not to. "I'm not asking because of the legal standing," he said. "The deed already does that. I'm not asking because of tonight, or the well, or because of—" He stopped. "I'm asking because this is your house, and I want the record to say so." He paused. "In every way that a record can say something." Sarah was very still. She was thinking about the 11 days of walking, about the creek south of here and soft bread from a coat pocket, about a gate that opened when it could have stayed closed, about a storm sealed inside 4 walls, about a rope around her waist and a boy in the dark and a hand on her shoulder, about a deed in her pouch with both their names on it, about a man who had stood outside a door for 20 seconds and then come back. "You already said not because you feel guilty," she said. "I did. And you meant it." "I did." She looked at the lamp. She looked at him. "All right," she said, for the third time. The same two words that had accumulated meaning each time she'd said them, until now they held the weight of every choice she'd made since she walked off the flats and into this man's gate. He nodded. Once. Like they had agreed on something practical. Which they had. Which was also something more than practical. Which was, she suspected exactly how it was supposed to work. Day 30. Pastor Elam Grove came on a Tuesday morning with his Bible under his arm and a folded paper inside it. He was a practical man. The intangible needed infrastructure, and he was the one who built it. He had spoken to Price. He had spoken to the county clerk. He had drafted the paperwork himself, which was slightly outside his official capacity and precisely within his actual character. He stood in the yard of the Harlan homestead and looked at the two people in front of him. Cobb in his best shirt, which was his only shirt without a tear in it. Sarah in the cotton she had sewn herself from the bolt Cobb had bought from the store 6 weeks ago. The dress was simple and fitted and made with the precision of someone who understood that you sew a thing right the first time because fabric doesn't have a second time. Price stood to the left, hat in his hands. Willa Such stood to the right. She had brought cornbread in a cloth. She had been practicing not crying since the night before and was doing moderately well. The pastor opened his Bible. He had shortened the ceremony to the essential parts, because these were people who dealt in essentials. "Do you take this woman?" he said to Cobb. "Yes," Cobb said. No hesitation. No I do with the formal weight of it, just yes. Simple and absolute. "Do you take this man?" he said to Sarah. She looked at Cobb, at the ears that still stuck out too far, at the hands that had held a rope above a well, at the jaw that had been set against the wind for 5 years and was right now softer than she had ever seen it. "Yes," she said. The pastor produced the paper. They signed Cobb first, then Sarah. Price signed as witness. Willa Such signed as witness, and did cry briefly, and did not apologize for it. Pastor Grove stamped the paper and folded it carefully. "That's done," he said, which was in its way the most pastoral thing he could have said. They ate Willa's cornbread in the yard, 5 of them sitting on whatever was available, the stoop and upturned crate a fence post serving as a leaning post. The August sun was already hot, but a suggestion of breeze came from the west, and the windmill turned in its steady, indifferent way. Willa asked Sarah how the corn was coming. Sarah said the first shoots were visible along the windbreak line. Willa said her husband's family had grown corn in Tennessee before they came west, and she'd always missed it. Sarah said she could show her the variety she'd planted. Willa said she'd like that. And that was all it was. 2 women talking about corn on an August morning. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The kind of conversation that happens 10,000 times a day in 10,000 yards across the territory. Except it wasn't. Because 6 weeks ago Willa Such would not have sat in this yard, would not have eaten cornbread in this company, would not have asked about corn in the easy way you ask someone you expect to know for a long time. The town had not become warm, but it had become fair, which was different, which was harder to achieve and in the end more durable. On the 35th day early morning before the heat arrived, Cobb was at the fence the way he always was at first light. He heard her step on the porch. He didn't turn. He knew that step the way you know the sounds of the place you live. She came down off the porch and across the yard, and he heard her go to the lean-to, and heard the sound of something being moved, something being opened, and then she was at the fence beside him, with a brush and a tin of paint. He looked at the brush, looked at the paint, looked at her face, the expression of a person who has been planning something and is pleased to be doing it. "What color?" he said. She showed him the tin. Dark red, the red of the Arizona earth, the red of the soil in the back quarter where the corn was coming up, the red of the rock faces at the ridge, the red of the land itself. He understood without needing more words. She opened the tin and dipped the brush and turned to the gate. She painted it slowly, carefully, the way she stitched with the understanding that you do a thing right, because right is what lasts. The brush moved over the wood, and the old gray gave way to the dark red of the earth, and the gate began to look like it had grown there, like it belonged to the ground underneath it and the sky above it. Cobb watched. He didn't help. This was not a thing that needed help. This was a thing that needed witnessing. When she finished the first side, she stepped back and looked at it. He came to stand beside her. The gate stood in the morning light, dark red, fresh, part of the land in a way it hadn't been before. "You changed it," he said. She turned to look at him. "No," she said. "I made it true." He held her eyes. He thought about Ruel, not with the old crushing weight of it, but with something softer, something that felt, if not like peace, then at least like the approaching edge of peace, the light at the far end of a long corridor. He was not absolved. He didn't need to be. He needed to be different. And he was. And that was the work, not the grand gesture, not the dramatic moment of choosing right over wrong. The work was the gate, the deed, the rope, the corn, the daily return to the fence with a hammer, the daily choice not to look away. "Ruel would have liked you," he said. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Tell me about him," she said. And he did. He talked about Ruel while she finished painting the second side of the gate. A boy who slept like the dead and moved through the world with a kind of unhurried certainty and always went in when going in was needed. Who had brown eyes and a laugh that started in his stomach and worked outward. Who had appeared at a stockyard in Kansas with his coat full of trouble and his hands full of plans and 2 days to spend with his older brother. He talked until the gate was painted. Then he stopped. Sarah set the brush down and looked at the gate and then at the land beyond it, the corn coming up along the windbreak, the cattle already moving in the early light, the back quarter with its darker soil waiting for next season. "He would have done this," she said. "Gone in, opened the gate." "Yes," Cobb said. "That was exactly who he was." "Then you learned something from him," she said. "Even after." He looked at the gate, dark red, real, already part of the land it stood in. "Yeah," he said. "I think I did." The deed was filed. The corn came up. The wind moved through the windbreak that Sarah had set low and right, and the soil in the back quarter held its moisture, and the cattle were fat going into September, and the fence line was tight on all 4 sides. Duskwell did not become warm. It became fair. Fair meant that when Sarah walked the main street, conversations didn't stop. Fair meant Willa Such sometimes saved the good coffee for when she came in. Fair meant Price tipped his hat and meant it. Fair meant the men who had come with a torch that night were quietly embarrassed by it, in the way men are embarrassed by things they can't undo. Not love, but something you could stand on, something you could plant in. Cobb stood at the fence and felt the sensation of a man who has stopped running from himself. Not dramatic, not sudden, just the absence of the thing that had been following him since Kansas. The weight of it finally set down. Sarah came to stand beside him. She had her cup and her eyes on the horizon. They stood there for a while, not saying anything, because they had learned separately over years and miles and kinds of loss that had no clean names, that the most important things rarely needed saying, that the deepest commitments expressed themselves in the daily return. In the hammer picked up again, the fence post reset, the water hauled and the stove banked and the name signed beside another name on paper that outlasted both of them. In the gate, dark red in the morning light. Open, as it would remain. Not because it was easy, because some things you choose not to close again, and the choosing made daily, made faithfully made without the guarantee of outcome. That was love. Not the word, the thing itself. The land stretched wide and enormous and indifferent around them. The corn rows were visible from here, the windmill turned, the cattle moved, the gate stood open, and stayed that way.